Imagine standing on a frozen ridge in the middle of a brutal South Dakota winter, where the wind, dose, and tea just blow at bites through layers of wool and skin until your bones feel like they are remade of glass. Now, imagine watching a man spend every waking hour, for years on end, digging a hole into the side of a solid rock mountain with nothing but hand tools and a stubborn, almost frightening look in his eyes. In the late 1800s, in the rugged Black Hills near the town of Deadwood, that man was James Jim Scott, a local pioneer whom everyone in town had privately decided was losing his mind, while other men were out hunting for gold or building sturdy timber cabins to protect their families from the coming frost. Jim was obsessed with a project that seemed like a total waste of human life, a massive winding tunnel that led absolutely nowhere. People would ride by on their horses, see him covered in gray dust and sweat even in the freezing cold, and they would literally laugh out loud, calling it Scott's Folly or the useless hole. They told him he was digging his own grave, that the mountain would eventually swallow him whole, and that he was neglecting his safety for a dream that had no purpose in a world where survival was the only thing that mattered. But Jim Scott didn't stop. He just kept swinging that pickaxe, day after day, month after month, carving a path through the dark stone while the rest of the world moved on without him. He wasn't looking for gold, he wasn't looking for silver, and he wasn't looking for a shortcut to another town. He was building something that only made sense in his own head, a deep, reinforced sanctuary carved into the very heart of the earth. His neighbors in the valley below were busy stockpiling grain and firewood, preparing for the standard winter, but they did it with a sense of arrogance, believing their wooden walls and stone fireplaces were more than enough to handle whatever the sky threw at them. They mocked Jim because, to them, time was money, and Jim was spending his time on a tunnel that offered no profit, no comfort, and no logic. He became a ghost of a man, a hermit of the hills who lived in the shadow of his own creation, ignored by the community except when they needed a good joke at the local saloon. Nobody knew that the weather patterns were shifting, or that a once-in-a-century storm was brewing in the north, a monster of ice and wind that was about to turn their comfortable valley into a frozen graveyard. As the sky turned a strange, bruised shade of purple and the temperature began to drop faster than anyone had ever seen, the laughter in the valley started to die down, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The old-timers looked at the horizon and realized that this wasn't just another snowstorm. This was a white death scenario, a blizzard so powerful it could bury a two-story house in a matter of hours. While the townspeople scrambled to board up their windows and pull their livestock into flimsy barns, Jim Scott stood at the mouth of his useless tunnel, watching the first flakes fall with a heavy heart. Knowing that the mountain was the only thing strong enough to stand against what was coming, he had spent years preparing for a nightmare that everyone else thought was a fantasy. And now, as the wind began to howl like a dying animal, the true purpose of his tunnel was about to be revealed in the most terrifying way possible. The people who had spent years calling him a fool were about to realize that the man they laughed at held the only key to their survival. But as the first waves of the blizzard hit, the question was just whether they could get to the tunnel. It was whether Jim Scott would even open the door for the people who had treated him like a joke. When the blizzard finally slammed into the Black Hills, it wasn't a gradual snowfall. It was a violent, blinding wall of white that instantly erased the horizon and turned the familiar woods into a confusing, deadly maze. Houses groaned under the weight of the wind, and within 3 hours, the snow was already piling up against the doors, trapping families inside while the temperature plummeted to levels that could freeze a man's lungs if he breathed too deeply. In the valley, the sturdy cabins that the townspeople were so proud of began to fail. The wood cracked under the pressure of the snowdrifts, and the fireplaces couldn't keep up with the icy drafts screaming through the gaps in the walls. People were huddled together in the dark, listening to the terrifying sound of their roofs groaning, realizing with horror that they were effectively buried alive in wooden boxers that were slowly turning into ice chests. This was the moment the laughter stopped completely, replaced by the realization that Jim Scott, the madman on the hill, was sitting in a fortress of solid rock that didn't care about the wind or the cold. The very thing they had mocked his obsession with, the deep, silent earth, was now the only place on the planet that felt safe. But the path to reach him was now hidden under 10 feet of shifting, killing snow. One family, the Millers, who lived closest to the base of Scott's Mountain, realized their roof was about to cave in from the sheer weight of the pack, and in a moment of pure desperation, they decided to make a run for it. They knew the general direction of the tunnel, but in a blizzard of this magnitude, you can't see your own hand in front of your face. And the cold saps your energy so fast that you start to feel a strange, sleepy warmth just before you die. They struggled through the drifts, screaming for help that was swallowed by the roar of the storm, feeling the frostbite take hold of their fingers and toes as they clawed their way toward the useless hole. Back at the tunnel, Jim Scott had transformed his dig site into a living space. With a small stove vented through a narrow shaft he'd spent months drilling and enough supplies to last out a siege, he heard a faint, rhythmic thumping against the heavy timber door he'd built to seal the entrance, a sound that shouldn't have been there in a storm that had supposedly cleared the mountain of all life. When he cracked the door open, the wind tried to rip it off its hinges, but he saw the frozen, ghost-like faces of his neighbors, the same people who had called him a crazy hermit just a week before at the general store. Jim didn't hesitate. He pulled them into the warmth of the earth, dragging their half-frozen bodies into the belly of the mountain where the air was still and the temperature stayed a constant, life-saving level. Word somehow spread through the desperate whispers of the valley as other families saw the faint glow of Jim's light or followed the tracks of those who had gone before. And soon, a steady stream of the wise were crawling toward the man they once called a fool. Inside the tunnel, it wasn't just a hole anymore. It was a cathedral of survival. With long hallways Jim had carved that acted as natural insulation against the screaming gale outside. He had built benches into the rock and storage nooks for blankets, almost as if he had known exactly how many people would eventually come knocking on his door in their darkest hour. But as the storm raged on for a second and then a third day, the tunnel began to fill up, and the resources Jim had spent years gathering were being stretched to the absolute limit. The irony was thick enough to choke on the town's survival, now depended entirely on a project they had spent a decade trying to discourage. But as the food ran low and the air grew thin, a new fear began to take hold of the survivors. By the fourth day of the Great Blizzard, the world outside had ceased to exist, replaced by a silent, white void that had claimed the lives of hundreds of cattle and destroyed dozens of homes across the territory. Inside Jim Scott's tunnel, the atmosphere was a mix of profound gratitude and deep, tumbling shame as the neighbors sat in the dark, listening to the muffled roar of the wind through the rock walls. They looked at the marks on the stone, the thousands of strike marks from Jim's pickaxe, and realized that every single one of those swings had been a heartbeat of preparation for their lives, even when they were mocking him. Jim didn't ask for apologies, and he didn't bring up the names they had called him. He simply shared his hard-earned warmth and his meager rations, proving that his vision wasn't born out of madness, but out of a deep, prophetic understanding of the land he lived on. When the skies finally cleared and the sun hit the snow with a blinding glare, the survivors emerged from the mountain to find their valley unrecognizable. Their homes crushed or buried, but their families intact because of one man's useless obsession. Jim Scott went from being the town joke to a living legend overnight, a man whose name became synonymous with foresight and the kind of rugged independence that built the American West. The story of the Scott Tunnel near Deadwood remains a powerful reminder that logic is often just a word for what people understand in the moment, and that the greatest innovations often look like failures until the exact moment they are needed. Today, we often see people working on projects that seem useless or crazy. The dreamers, the builders, the ones who see a threat or an opportunity that no one else can see, and our first instinct is still to laugh or judge. But history, like the blizzard of the 8th, has a way of vindicating the people who are willing to endure the mockery of the crowd to build something that lasts. Jim Scott didn't just dig a tunnel. He dug a bridge between a community that did believe in him and a future that required his unique brand of insanity to survive. The tunnel eventually fell into disrepair, and the mountain reclaimed much of his work. But the lesson stayed carved into the hearts of every family that walked out of that rock and back into the sun. It teaches us that being right isn't nearly as important as being prepared, and that sometimes the person you think is a fool is actually the only one who truly knows what's coming. Before you click away, think about this. Is there something in your life right now that you're reworking in a dream, a project, a goal that everyone else thinks is a useless tunnel? Maybe this is your sign to keep digging, because you never know when the storm is going to hit and make you the only one with a roof over your head. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most misunderstood heroes, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story of survival against the odds. We've got plenty more stories, like Jim Scott's, coming your way. Stories that prove the world is built by the people who aren't afraid to be laughed at. Would you like me to tell you the story of the man who spent 30 years carving a mountain for a different reason? Or should we look at another folly that ended up saving an entire city? Let me know in the comments below.